Hi, everybody. We'd like to get started. Our Grand Rounds is really a wonderful theater of the possible. When I look at the lectures that we have had over the last couple of weeks, a talk on prefrontal connectivity and glutamate neurotransmission related to ketamine antidepressant treatment, then transgenic monkeys. Today's lecture on authors at broken places, a mother and trans son pick up the pieces, just goes with the flow. I thought I would just let you know about the upcoming lectures in this series. Next week is the first annual Sid Blatt Memorial Lecture. The Blatt family made a gift to the department to support the creation of a lecture in the memory of Sid Blatt. Sid was a member of our faculty, I think, for 60 years, and for 40 years of that, something like 40 years, was head of the psychology section. And someone who worked closely with him, Paul Wachtel, who's at the City University of New York, will be giving a lecture on revisiting the dynamics of personality beyond diagnostic categories, developmental levels, and linear formulations. And then the following week, Bob Kearns from our department will be talking about transforming pain care in America, promoting adaptive pain self-management. So it's a very interesting series. I hope to see you all at these upcoming lectures, and I will now introduce Dr. Krusto to introduce our speakers today.
Good morning, everyone. So today we continue our journey toward greater diversity in Grand Round speakers and topics. As we hear from Mary and Donald Collins, authors of the book At Broken Places, A Mother and Trans Son Pick Up the Pieces. I first heard Mary and Donald present here at CMHC last June as a part of their Poynter Fellowship here at the university, which brings outstanding journalists from the United States and abroad to the university to gain special insight into the media and its role in contemporary culture. So I want to thank Michael Cerniak and Kyle Peterson for bringing Donald and Mary last year, and for Michael Cerniak for suggesting that we bring them back for Grand Rounds so that we and they can reach a larger audience in our department. This session also is a wonderful follow-up to Grand Rounds presentation by Christy Oleski, Susan Boulware, and Anisha Patel last fall, in which they presented on working with the transgender and gender-expansive population. So this morning, we get to hear directly about a family's experience. Mary Collins worked for 20 years as a freelance writer and editor for a range of clients, including the National Geographic Society and Smithsonian Institution. She is currently a professor of nonfiction at Central Connecticut State University, where she won the Teaching Award. At Broken Places is her 5th nonfiction book. Donald Collins is a trans advocate, writer, and recent cum laude graduate of Emerson College. His culture and contemporary writings has appeared in Pop Matters, Salon, and Next Magazine, among others. He speaks regularly on the college circuit on trans issues, including most recently at Trinity College and Wesleyan University. The format for today's session is that Mary and Donald will provide some opening remarks, and then each will read passages from their book. Then we'll open it up to the floor for question and answers. So please welcome me in joining Mary and Donald Collins.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay with the mic? Again, another shout out to Michael and Kyle. I can't thank them enough. For this particular book, with my other books, you could do the sort of the bookstore route, but this book, we really want to reach the professionals that are going to reach these families. And so to be here today is really special for Donald and I. This was years of work and a lot of emotional wrestling, and to be in the room where we can talk directly to the people that would have worked with us if we had gotten the help that we needed, myself in particular, is one of the most meaningful things we could be doing with the book. So thank you for all, for a very busy time. We were talking how busy January is, that you are taking time out today to hear our story. We really appreciate it. The other day I was talking with my creative writing class at Central, where I run the writing minors, and I was giving them exposure to a creative thinking exercise where I was asking them to smell spices and free associate. So I gave them like oregano. So they were like, oh, smells like pasta. And I was like, that's the obvious answer. So let's now do the creative writing class and free associate. Don't be linear in your thinking. So then they kept working at it, and one of the students came up with, oh, it smells like my grandfather's chest in the attic, and he was a World War II vet, and the next thing we know, we weren't talking about oregano anymore. Well, I feel like this is a little bit about what needs to happen in the medical schools, social work programs, physician assistant programs. They hear trans, and it's like, oh, pasta. But you need to do creative thinking. It's much more complicated than that. So I felt like the exercise was very relevant to what we're really going to try to be doing today, was just to broaden your mind about the reach that has to happen to truly care for trans individuals and the emotional transitions that their families and often colleagues and friends are going through. So it's a great victory for Donald and I that we are even here talking about this. I'm going to be blunt and tell you that we almost did not make it as a family. And I couldn't have loved anything more. So people can make all sorts of reasons about why things turned so dark. But I think the real reason was it was far more difficult for all of us involved than anyone ever wanted to concede or talk about. The basics. I had my daughter, whom we will refer to throughout this exercise and in the book as just the letter J. She came out in high school, told me that she was a trans man. As a creative writer in Washington, D.C., I'd had a very large group of gay, bi, lesbian friends, a lot of creative people, but 9 years ago, I had never heard the word transgender. Before Caitlyn Jenner, before Laverne Cox, here I was thinking that I was a person who was really involved in the arts, and that word came to my ears, empty. What is that? So, of course, the emptiness, what comes with that? Fear. I had a lot of fear. I had to make it absolutely clear that I celebrate every individual's right to realize their identity. And I felt that way even at that time, which made my own conflicting feelings about Donald's medical decisions especially difficult to bear, because I couldn't wrestle with the disconnect. How do I protect my daughter from medical procedures that I might not agree with? How do I celebrate my transgender son in the same moment? And it was a conundrum that it wasn't happening naturally for me. And I also turned into a very bizarre level of grief over the sense of the daughter I thought I had, who I felt on some level was sort of evaporating on some level in front of me. So I was feeling these deep-seated feelings of grief that I had more normally associated when my father had died and I was 14. And I thought, but nobody's died. Like, why am I having these feelings? So I tried to get a little bit of professional help, but they were just basically like, yeah, that's sad. I'm sorry. You're just going to have to get used to what's happened. And that was the extent of the professional help I received. And I went to 3 different counselors. So they didn't know how to handle me. And then that made it difficult for me to help Donald. Now, at one point, I turned to the power of writing. And I can't emphasize enough the power of narrative, not opinion writing. I have to make that really clear. We're talking about personal narrative, where you storytell and you unveil your story and you let the reader arrive at their own conclusions about what you're writing. That's what I was already doing as a writer. So I started to turn to that, and I wrote a piece called Mapping Modern Grief about what an unusual sense of loss I was having, and that this was unique to my time, and that I had never met another parent that was going through this type of grief. And I showed it to my son, Donald, and asked permission to publish it in a literary journal. And what courage he showed to say, okay, I embrace what you're going through. He could have judged me, But again, it wasn't an opinion piece. It was more like an illuminating piece. Like, look at the weird feelings I'm having about this. He read it, accepted it, I published it, and that was the beginning of the book project that you're going to hear about today. We had to do it together because we were not processing the experience in the same way. So the book does not run linear. We might be at the kitchen table and Donald's coming out, and in his essay, he reveals what's going through his mind, and I, in mine, reveal what's going through mine. And you're thinking, this is the same event? But there's no judgment, like he wasn't wrong and I wasn't wrong, it just was. So the book constantly returns to the same scenarios. It doesn't move chronological at all. It's amazing to me, some of the statistics we were talking at our breakfast this morning. One of the things that made me work hard to try to figure this out wasn't just love. It was a sense of duty. I'd had a child and it was my job to figure this out. But also that fear thing. It was smart that people told me that nearly 50% of trans teens and college-age students end up homeless. It was smart that they told me that they have way higher levels of suicide and addiction. Because I'll tell you, if you love your child and you hear those numbers, you're like, okay, I have got to figure this out. The stakes are huge. And people around you can be very glib about it. Oh, don't worry, Jay is just going through a phase. But I knew my child, and this is not a phase. This is fundamental to my child's identity, and something profound is happening. And don't discount it as just a thing that they're doing. Oh, so they're wearing more masculine clothes now, whatever. No, it was real and it was deep, and when you heard those statistics, you realized how serious the stakes were. So you can imagine that when I did not get the help that I needed, how scary that was. And then, of course, that put a lot of pressure on Donald, and he and I agree that if I had received more help, that would have helped him. So if you're in the room feeling, I work with trans individuals and they're my top priority, especially someone who's 17 or 18 in such a vulnerable state. The parents are already losing rights at that age, right? Just naturally and legally, 16 to 18. And then it's exacerbated by these dramatic decisions that the trans individual might be making. And if you can realize that it's a unit going through this emotional transition, it's so validating to listen to all the stories and try to process them without judgment. Again, we're the power of narrative essay. And I know that Columbia has an interesting medical narrative program. I'm not sure that you have that here. I should have taken the time to look, but it's a fantastic concept, especially, I think, for family of trans individuals. So I'm going to move right to the reading because I feel like the book sort of speaks for itself, and I want to give Donald equal time. But that's the background. Donald was incredibly brave to agree to do this book with me. He was in Los Angeles at the time, and I had come up with 3 other topics besides grief. For example, rights, parent rights versus individual rights, like a teen or a college-age student's rights. He wrote his own essays, and I did not touch those essays. So if you do read this book, you will think that I did because his writing is really remarkable for his age. I touched nothing, and he touched nothing. So that was the power of the book. It is blunt in its emotional rawness, and it's where we were 8 years ago. We have since been living together the last year and a half, and I was just teasing Donald that how wonderful it is that all I have to worry about now as a parent is like, why haven't you taken out the trash? You know, I'm like, that's the only problem we have to worry about. This is great. So I do appreciate just the daily parts of being a parent again, and it's such a beautiful thing and something that you cherish more than anything probably in your life. I'm going to read from the chapter Mismatch, which is where we explore what happens in gender and sexuality and what does it mean to feel a mismatch with your gender. And that's because in this section I feel like I outline well the conundrum I faced as a parent. What was more important to me in my role as a mother? To protect Jay from being dismantled step by step, or to empower Donald to emerge with a new identity as a trans man? In an effort to remain true to myself as a single mother of an only child, I could not willingly go along with completely erasing Jay. The biological father walked when I was still pregnant. The stepfather, whom I divorced when Donald was 13, manages to see him once or twice a year. There are no siblings, just me and Jay. a family, 2 females, 1 mother, and 1 daughter. All the various factors in my personal life led me to a career and financial situation more commonly associated with a man. I took charge of everything, bought my own house, excelled at work, and was continually promoted to ever more demanding jobs. When I first moved from the South to New England after my divorce, I actually wrangled with my future employer over my starting salary, and later I learned from the top administrator that I was the only woman she had ever met who had done that. In her experience, only men had the gumption to press for more cash before they even started a job. With no child support or life support to help me, I had become ever more gender neutral in how I lived my life to care for my young daughter. But as Jay transformed into Donald and everything flipped, I find myself shifting into ever more traditional feminine roles. I wanted to go to the mother-daughter tea at the high school, but Donald declined. I wanted Donald to wear a white dress to the high school graduation like all the other young women, but he arrived in a suit and tie. I used food to heal the wounds that kept opening between us, making sure I prepared fine meals like fresh swordfish and homemade mashed potatoes for Donald so we'd eat together and talk about the things we both loved, reading, writing, art, humor, rather than fall into our excruciating disagreements. Donald became more assertive about shaping his own life and secured internships he never would have aspired to as a young woman. As Jay, my child feared talking to cashiers when buying a bagel. But as Donald, he lived on his own in New York City before even graduating college and plunged into the high-octane world of TV production. He bluntly admitted to me that life in the United States is easier and much more fun living as a man. He feels nature pulled a nasty trick and put him in the wrong body, and he's working to adjust that. I feel nature gave me a daughter and then unexpectedly took her away. Both of these feelings and impressions are true and authentic. I do not need to be a woman, and Donald does not have to be a man to understand the agony inherent in that conundrum. We are just trying to find a way to be humane to each other. One of the issues we faced as a family was disclosure. And I have to make it clear that it had never had anything to do with shame-based. I was never, ever ashamed of my Donald or myself. We were just wrestling with a difficult situation that could often make other people feel very uncomfortable. And there's certain scenarios where you don't want to reveal your situation because you don't feel safe. So disclosure is a very complicated topic, and so that was one of our subtopics. So one of the issues was how to disclose to the family. And as you'll see in this short section, in the same way that the medical community failed me utterly, my 94-year-old mother was the most remarkable person, and I have to add she was and is a Republican. Of course, she doesn't like Trump. I'm going to be a little political here. She doesn't like Trump. She voted for Obama. God bless her. But she was a moderate. She was a moderate Republican for most of her life, and more interested in sort of voting for the candidate. So here she is at the time, like 88, loves us both, and Donald comes out as transgender, and she created the safe, neutral space that we needed so that we did not feel judged for grieving, and Donald did not feel judged for his need to transition, and that we would be loved despite our differences. And she was remarkable, and we dedicated the book to her. My immediate family has fully embraced the transition story now after many rough years when some of us thought Jay was moving too fast to become Donald and was too young to make such radical decisions or changes to his or her body. Some of us thought it was a passing phase. Some accepted it immediately, in part because they weren't all that emotionally invested in Jay to begin with, so they didn't feel they were losing anything. My 90-year-old mother wept when she heard that her beloved granddaughter wanted to be embraced as a grandson. For many months, my mother went through a strange period of grief, continuing to reach out and embrace Jay as Donald, but mourning the slipping away of all evidence of Jay as a girl. The golden red hair became a cropped buzz cut, and the gift of a Vera Bradley bag got stowed in the closet. It was as though in a matter of days she held a funeral for one grandchild and then crafted a new memory book for a different grandchild. I was astounded at how smoothly she pulled this off. The eldest of the extended family, the one with the longest track record of loss, 2 husbands, most of her friends, several of her siblings, on a racetrack to a new space so she would not lose her grandchild entirely. My 90-year-old grandmother, my 90-year-old mother was the first to bring Donald to buy clothes in the men's department. My 90-year-old mother was the first to tell me to my face without flinching that Jay was never coming back and Donald was here to stay and I must accept it. My 90-year-old mother still talks about when Jay was a child and visited her in Florida or lost to her at Scrabble. Yeah, that's right. And went to New York City to watch the Christmas show at Radio City Music Hall and bought a $10 chocolate-covered strawberry at Rockefeller Center. 1 strawberry for $10. You know, she was a Depression-era baby. She never got over that. They photographed it before eating it. She shifts more easily than I do between such recollections of her beloved granddaughter's past and the reality of now. She has a wry quality about her whenever she talks about any of it, as though after 9 decades, it's not that she's seen everything, but that she has somehow weathered all that she has seen. Just last year, she disclosed to me that one of her sisters also has a transgender grandchild. My aunt's son became a woman named M. And then finally, Beacon, which was a spectacular press, by the way, if anybody's interested in, they have the rights to the James Baldwin papers, and they have a fantastic civil rights title list. And if you're ever in that general subject area, we had a spectacular experience with the editorial staff there. And we had the idea of interviewing other parents, other queer, gay, bi, lesbian, trans individuals, and professionals, but we had sort of just started it, and they wanted us to expand that. I wasn't sure what I was going to find. Donald had no problem finding people, and I had a terrible time getting parents to be honest with me. So I can't emphasize enough to all the professionals in the room how full of fear they are, that if they show their fear, you will tell them, well, then you don't love your child, and that is not true. Finding parents willing to share their stories. She takes my call or email, but then says no, she does not want to be interviewed. He apologizes. They are all afraid. I assure them they do not have to be identified. All I need is their story so we can share it with other parents going through similar tensions and trauma. I was lucky in my first attempt, but after that, I sent out more than 20 emails. I made 6 pleading phone calls before I coaxed one other parent to share how he or she felt about what happened to their family when their child told them that he or she was transgender. We wanted a wide range of voices: immigrants, economically disadvantaged individuals, fathers, small-town families. But 1/3 of the people who agreed to be interviewed ultimately changed their mind and pulled their text. Imagine that, a 6-month deadline. I kept saying, well, she just pulled her story. And of course, the people who feel most marginalized really show up at support groups. PFLAG organizations nationwide offer outstanding help to gay, bi, lesbian, trans, and queer individuals, but such groups are not well set up to handle the angry parent. Discussions usually focus on how to help a child through his or her transition and how to help the parent get it. All of that is understandable because the teens and college-age young adults are going through a transition, already face enormous personal obstacles and pressures. The counselors and medical professionals feel they must first focus on the young. But if I wanted to find parents with a range of experiences, I could not rely on LGBTQ organizations because the pool of parents who work with those organizations are self-selecting. They are on board enough to go. I was not. 8 years ago, if a reporter had called me, I would not have agreed to tell my story. I would not have trusted anyone because every time I expressed my doubt, shared my grief, or felt shocked by the medical options available to my child, I was quieted, even spurned. An aggressively questioning parent like me did not fit into the available groups. I needed to get further along towards acceptance before I could sit in the circle, they said. These many years later, I realized I should have looked harder because the majority of parents of transgender children, at least initially, feel more in line of how I felt at that time. At least 40% of transgender children wind up homeless at some point, which to me translates to mean that nearly half of all trans children, parents of trans children, are so conflicted about what's going on that they are drowning. There are not enough places right now for those parents. Many of them will come to fully embrace everything about their transgender child. Others may come to some satisfactory space where they agree to disagree and move back to just loving each other. Those who do this more positive journey are largely out there on their own right now. I seriously believe the homelessness rate for transgender youth could be cut in half with more support programs for conflicted parents. If they felt more respected, felt heard, and weren't told to get it before they know what it is, they might not become so afraid and enraged. As one parent told me, to be asked to just go along with such a radical change is to, quote, strip me of my humanity. Thank you. Now, I'd like to introduce my better half and my courageous son, Donald.
Hello, everybody. Hello, medical friends. All right, I'm gonna take a photo of y'all because our press always complains that we don't do social media. And it's like, all right, so my name is Donald. I was gonna make a transgenic monkey joke, but then I was like, no, I'm gonna skip it. All right, so as mentioned, I went to Emerson College for Film and Television, and I studied mostly screenwriting, and I minored in gender studies. I lived in Los Angeles for a year, and I'm currently working at an indie bookstore in Middletown, the Wesley and R.J. Julia bookstore. It's super awesome. You should come by. And I'm applying to grad schools, so that is my life right now. So as my mom mentioned, I was in California when she asked me to do this book project, and I'm not saying that I moved to California to completely escape my past and reality on the East Coast, but it was probably like 75% of that. So when I got out there and she was like, hey, do you want to write this book about like the most vulnerable and terrible moments of your life? I was like, hell no. And then eventually I realized that, you know, being in California was the first time that I really was away from my support network that I built out here. And I felt sort of very isolated, and I had a lot of sort of stewing that I did in my own mind, and realized that there was a lot that I still hadn't worked through. And so I agreed to do the project because it would also help me connect to parents, I think, humanize, and also show them that like you can have a child that has a life, like a good life in the world. And a lot of parents, when their kids first come out, are like, you know, my kids, no one's ever gonna love them. Like, how are they gonna find work? Like, you know, they're just gonna be discriminated against and prejudiced against their whole life, and their life's gonna be terrible. And I think that really motivated me to telling my story. I really don't like media attention, so we purposely went with a press that wouldn't make me do TV or anything like that. So I love this kind of stuff, so thank you all for coming. Is this mandatory? I don't know, but thank you for coming. I was like, So the last event we did was mandatory for honor students, and I was like, thank you for reading our book. But so obviously medical care has been a huge part of my life for the last decade. And I was very fortunate that I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. I've always lived in large metropolitan progressive areas. And when I went to Boston, that was also the case. Of course, Boston has Fenway Health, which is the largest LGBT health center in the country, as long as my information is correct. I had an overwhelmingly positive experience with healthcare, which is highly irregular for trans people. A lot of that was because I was near those large cities, and they had, even like 7 or 8 years ago, those select professionals who really knew their stuff and were really kind of like in their prime. So my healthcare actually started in the New Haven area. I went to an endocrinologist named Ilya Hulinsky in West Haven, who is amazing and just incredibly like gentle, communicative, really explained everything to me, made me feel like seen as a trans person and as like an adult. And I went to a support group with Tony Ferriolo, who does a lot of work in the trans community. He runs an amazing support group for young people in New Haven. I think it's called Translation. And so I think that I obviously have a very conflicted relationship with healthcare because I had such a great experience with my therapist, with my psychiatrist. And just to, put some numbers out there, I've had 5 therapists and seen 3 separate psychiatrists. And that is in addition to various PAs and nurse practitioners and doctors. And all of these people have at various points contributed letters that I needed to get my license changed, my passport changed, which just happened about a month ago, 5 years after my first name change, because it's so expensive to change that stuff. And you need so much documentation, and none of it has to do with my word. The first time I went to a DMV and said, I want to change the M on my license, like an idiot, I just showed up and was like, hey, can I do this? And they were like, heck no. Do you have any proof? And I literally was just like, just my life. That's the proof. And they were like, well, that's not good enough. You need to have an hour consultation with a doctor that's never going to see you again. And they need to be like, yes, this person confirmed male. I was like, okay. So in my experience before I start my reading, I want to say that the single most important factor in my relationship with any kind of healthcare professional was not that they knew all the right words or that they had all the legal policies memorized, but that they cared and they tried to create a respectful, safe place for me and were invested. So I can't thank you enough for being here. And all of my doctors, it doesn't take a lot to just do a little bit of research if that's, if you're interested in working with the trans population. And it really made a difference. It totally changed my life. I really credit particularly 2 therapists with really sort of saving my life for multiple years. So the chapter I'm going to read, I talk a little bit about endocrinology and healthcare as it relates to trans people, and a little bit about my personal experience. Some of you may be familiar with this background, but I found it very empowering to learn about as a trans person, helped me contextualize my experience in the medical realm. And then if I feel like I have time, I'll read a brief passage from the interview section. I realized that I left my book in my backpack like a consummate professional. She keeps taking my book and hiding it places, putting it away. All right. I just got new glasses, and so I'm gonna wear them because I haven't been. Okay. All right. Am I being loud enough? I can't tell which microphone is the real microphone. Okay. All right. Dr. H is like the human embodiment of a cheerful wink. I trusted him immediately, although the stuffy atmosphere of his waiting room didn't forecast his winning character. Small TVs showed closed caption talk shows, and last year's People magazines were spread out on tables. Everyone there, except for another trans person my age, looked over 60 and struggling. The woman at reception exhibited saintly patience as I fished ID cards out of my overstuffed backpack. Dr. H sat with me for an hour, explaining how testosterone worked, why I was starting at the dose he was prescribing, and when my blood would be tested. He drew a little picture of a line graph, a little floating hill that represented the effects of T in my system over the 2-week shot intervals. The goal, he explained, is that your waves aren't too up and down. We want to keep the level of T in your body as consistent as possible. Healthcare professionals like Dr. H, who are welcoming, communicative, and trans-positive, are in high demand and short supply. Although that's changing, which is awesome. Diabetes is the most common endocrine disorder, followed by thyroid diseases like goiter and Hashimoto's. Hormone replacement treatment as developed for non-trans people started in the 1930s to aid menopausal women and men with hypergonadism. Around this time, trans medicine was just getting on its feet. One of the most famous endocrinologists in this new field was Harry Benjamin, who died in 1986, a German-born doctor and colleague of Magnus Hirschfeld, who died in 1935, the renowned sexologist whose Berlin-based Institute for Sexual Science pioneered the study and understanding of gender and sexual diversity. Nazis burned the Institute's library in 1933, which led Hirschfeld to flee for France, where he would remain until his death 2 years later. Harry Benjamin set up practice in San Francisco, where he soon became the leading medical authority on transsexuality, in quotes, collaborating with other progressives such as Alfred Kinsey. However, while Benjamin advanced the medical interest and understanding of trans health needs, he also contributed to a set of treatment guidelines that psychiatrists and doctors, that sort of placed psychiatrists and doctors in total control. And in fact, those treatment guidelines are the template for the ones that still exist today, if not many of them are directly still in existence. Trans people who were chosen for surgical and hormone treatment had to check off a ridiculous list of prerequisites to please their gatekeepers. Ambitious physicians and researchers thus exploited a desperate population, those willing to submit to observation and invasive research in order to get medical care. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which DSM, sets the medical industry standard for diagnosis and treatment for every psychiatric disorder recognized by the U.S. healthcare system. Until 2012, gender identity disorder was the diagnosis for trans people. When I was approved for my top surgery, my insurance validated me as a true transsexual, a phrase that goes all the way back to Benjamin's 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomena. The DSM has since replaced gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria, attempting to acknowledge the emotional distress of gender dissonance and not infer mental illness. In May 2016, Lambda Legal released an updated and free publication called Creating Equal Access to Quality Healthcare for Transgender Patients, intending to aid physicians and medical centers in effectively and respectfully treating trans patients. The updated release followed on the heels of the Obama administration, confirming discrimination protections for LGBTQ people in medical environments under the Affordable Care Act. The safety of trans people in healthcare and the controlling way healthcare systems treat trans people are coming under scrutiny and are on the slow road to reform. But a diagnosis is absolutely still necessary to attain treatment promptly and legally. It's worth mentioning that a lot of trans people obtain their hormones illegally. Again, as I said, I've had 5 therapists, 2 psychiatrists, 3 general physicians, 3 endocrinologists, and 2 surgeons who are always sending each other letters about me. Today, hormone replacement is becoming a more culturally recognized option in trans healthcare. However, in part due to the recentness of its acceptability, we don't know a lot about its long-term effects. We do know through the use of hormone therapy in cis men and women, cis is non-trans, treatment for menopause, prostate cancer, chronic low hormone levels, there are significant risks associated with hormones, including an increased likelihood for cancer and cardiac problems. Like the word trans, hormone treatment is different for everyone and should be ideally tailored to an individual. Not everyone needs it or wants it. There's a broad range of doses. People are often surprised to learn that I'll take hormones for the rest of my life. Right now, that means a shot a week. This literally blows people's minds. Like, my friends will be like, so when does it stop? And I'll be like, forever. And they'll be like, but then, like, isn't there a time where, like, you don't have to do it anymore? And I'm like, it's forever. Never. Do I have to stop doing this? I just love needles so much. As of 2016, I've been on T for 5 years, firmly monitored by healthcare systems. To get this care covered, I have literally run all over the place for consultations, taking trains and buses to doctors, switched policies, switched back, won claims, lost others, sacrificed around 75% of my credit on the blue medical slice of my bank's convenient, wonderful pie graph spending report. Treatment and the ability to tailor its safety is a massive issue of access and privilege in the trans community. According to the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, which surveyed, I believe, over 6,000 people, it's one of the largest surveys that we have. So according to this survey, 20% of trans respondents report being uninsured. Among those incarcerated, 17% report being denied hormones outright. And although 62% overall had experienced hormone therapy, respondents weren't asked how they got their hormones. Unable to find or fill prescriptions, many trans folk procure through back doors, sharing with friends, or buying online. Testosterone instigated a complete sea change across my life. I began to feel invested in my body and actually start taking care of it. For much of my transition, I believed in a person no one else could see. I couldn't expect my mother to understand what it feels like to recognize this disconnection in oneself, the disconnection that therapy and psychiatry and hormone treatment helped me bridge. What I wanted more than my mom's understanding was her trust. By not supporting my healthcare decisions, I felt my mom didn't trust me to know what was best for myself. Gradually over time, my newfound confidence and well-being helped her reactivate this trust. Although she does not agree with my surgical healthcare, she doesn't deny the significant positive effects that all of this healthcare has had on my life. So I'm going to briefly read from a section from the back of the book. Yeah, all right. So this is an interview that I did with Drew Levasseur, who's the trans rights project director at Lambda Legal. And generally, if there's any major case in the news that has to do with a trans person, Drew is the person by their side helping them out, and he's unbelievable. So I'll briefly introduce him in his own words. Drew Levasseur is a white trans guy in his early 40s who is a trans activist and attorney. He grew up in New England, is based in New York. And the following are select excerpts from our conversation. I like this section because it talks about the role of families and how communities, including the medical community, are really instrumental in helping us kind of change those statistics around. So Drew explained he didn't enter law school intending to specialize in trans rights. I think going to law school was in part a survival tactic because I felt so unsafe in the world, he reflected. Being queer, being trans, you need all the tools you can get to protect yourself. He laughed as he recalled the email he sent his extended family upon finishing his last year. Graduation and gender update. We expanded on the idea of bad timing. I expressed that while being away from my family was terrible and not preferable, it was absolutely necessary for me while I was in college. I wouldn't have been able to maintain my emotional health otherwise, neither would my mother. But while I had the resources of a decent insurance policy, a strong network of friends, and an LGBTQ-friendly college environment, many trans folk find themselves financially cut off, uninsured, unhoused, and floating. And this is Drew speaking. Drew. Family acceptance is one of the keys to ending the suicide epidemic that we're seeing in the transgender community, and I think that families play a deeper role than people realize. What does that mean? We need to get families resources. We need to have visibility so that families have somewhere to turn when somebody comes out. This is such a critical and vulnerable time. We're losing people during that time period, and that is devastating not only to the movement, but to those families who couldn't turn that around, figure that out, and be there in the way that the person might have needed them. I'm really glad that people survive that time period, but a lot of people don't. And I think that's really where we need to focus our energy. Thank you. You took my water.
I took the other one.
Okay.
So we're going to do a Q&A now, which is sometimes our favorite part. We'll start here. I guess there's the one. Is this mic working? Yeah, so that's a working mic. Just move it. So this is always our favorite part because now we can see how is the audience just listening, what did they bring to this situation that they wanted to talk about. So we welcome raised hands. So, yes.
Thanks for coming, sharing your story. Can you talk, you said you have 3 psychiatrists, can you talk about an experience or something that they said or did that was particularly helpful?
Yes, so the question was, I mentioned that I had 3 psychiatrists, and could I talk about a moment where something was said that was particularly hurtful? I think for me, my bigger issue with psychiatrists was that they were ineffective. I didn't really have instances where they were saying hurtful things to me. I more so had instances where they were very unfamiliar with trans people and trans healthcare, and I was their first trans patient, and they weren't treating me at a therapeutic level. I saw a doctor in the mood disorders clinic of Tufts, and this is for issues separate to my transition. Obviously, you have to go to therapy if you're a trans person because you need that therapist to write 5,000 letters. But psychiatrists I went to because I struggle with a mood disorder, and my psychiatrist was like, I never had a trans patient. I'm worried about putting you on meds that might interact with your hormones, so we'll try you on like a tiny dose of meds. And we're talking so tiny that it wouldn't show up in my blood. And so despite the fact that I was still having a lot of mood problems, I wasn't really able to get to that level of being therapeutically medicated, which I really needed during that time period because my psychiatrists weren't reaching out. They weren't doing their research. They weren't, if you say you don't know anything about trans healthcare, well, I'd appreciate it if you'd maybe learn a little or tell me about someone who could, because this affects like my lived experience, and especially when you're going through something incredibly stressful, it can be life or death. And I have a fantastic psychiatrist now, and I used to be very anti-medication because I was definitely in that whole mindset where I was like, you should be able to beat this, like using the strength of your mind, like, blah. And now that I'm medicated, I'm like, oh, this is way better. I can live. Obviously not for everyone, disclaimer. So yeah, I would say that it wasn't necessarily like a one-time thing. Although, if I'm going to talk shade, I've had very terrible experiences with rheumatologists for some reason. They have been not nice. I've been very bullied by rheumatologists, but psychiatrists. It was helpful. Yeah, so it's interesting because my current psychiatrist almost immediately, I don't know how, she's like magic, but she immediately saw past all the trans stuff and was the classic sort of like, so how are things with your mother? And I was like, whoa, Dr. Loris, you're good. So I would say, even if you might think that the trans identity, I mean, I was talking earlier with, I think it was Dr. Van Dusen, if he's here. Hello. About how LGBT people oftentimes they want you to reach out, they want you to ask. Sometimes people aren't sure if this is going to be a safe space for them. They didn't always find a psychiatrist because they were like, I am a queer person, find me such a doctor that will like me. Sometimes it's just whoever's available to them. And they're going to almost want you to maybe make that first step in saying like, hey, like this is a safe space, and if you're queer, if you're LGBT, like I just want you to know, like I have experience with that, or I think we should engage that. I want you to feel comfortable. So having doctors really sort of like see me in that way, but not necessarily make the whole session about that, and let me kind of like take the lead on how much I wanted to bring in. So that was definitely probably the most helpful thing, was doctors just to kind of like to see me as a person and sort of open up that comfortable, trusting space for me. I think I saw something like that on some blogging site, something similar, where someone just had a card and was like, here are FAQs. I mean, I think it's interesting to bring up that, we talk about safety of women, safety of trans people, safety of queer people, but statistically the most the people who are in the most physical danger are those who are like gender indeterminable by people, if that's what I'm gonna say, like that come across as like, you know, we're not sure what gender they are. So that is a huge safety issue, and I do not have that problem. I'm in fact very lucky, or my reality is that, to use a word I don't like, I pass. Like, people do not identify me as a trans person on site. And you know, I'm in a class at Wesleyan right now, and nobody in my class knows I'm trans. Like, no one at work knew I'm trans until someone found my book and like left me a secret note and was like, "Hey, I found your book. Like, it's your book." I was like, "Wow, thanks, Brian." And I find that once, because I've chosen to be visible, that is then the piece that it comes from. But generally, it's only in situations like this. Like, I don't really have a lot of the times people coming up to me and being like, "Hey, like, you look like a queer person. Like, tell me about your vagina." And it's like, "Tell me about your vagina." You know what I mean? Like, get out of my way. And I think the hardest thing when I first came out was that I had never met another trans person when I first came out. Like, I hadn't. Like, it was within myself that I like found the trans person in me. But like, so when people started asking me those questions, I was totally unprepared to answer those questions. So I was just like saying shit. Like, I did not know what I was talking about. And people, if we see like with Caitlyn Jenner, people are preoccupied with bodies. Like, that is what they want to know about. They want to know about the surgeries. They want to know about genitals. They want to know about hormones. It's like, you know, it's incredibly voyeuristic, and so that's what people are going to talk about. And I find that I'm not a very irascible person. I'm pretty even when it comes to responding to those issues. So if I'm not going to answer a question, I 100%, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a person, I always tell them, like, why. Like, you don't need to know my birth name. My best friend's trans. I don't know his birth name. Like, it's not necessary. Like, you don't need to know my, like, sexual history, because, like, are we dating? Definitely not. Like, you know, so, but it's very stressful. And for my friends who are more visibly queer, it grates on them. And especially, like, you know, the wrong pronouns, the invasive bodily inquiries, it can really, at the end of the day, it can really affect your self-esteem, which I'm sure you're aware of. So. Yeah, that's an awesome question. So the question was, obviously I had a part of my life where I was, you know, living in this different gender. I was living in the female gender. And as therapists and psychiatrists, how can you kind of coalesce those experiences with the coming out experience with is that correct? Yeah, so it's funny because just yesterday I was showing my mom a photo of me when I was 7, for Throwback Thursday on Instagram, and it was a picture of me in a like shimmering metallic cloak with a huge terrifying alien mask on, and I used to sit in a little tinfoil box, and I was like, they should have known something was going on. But I would say that a lot of my trans friends, and I'm not necessarily one of these people, do have grief around those experiences of their life. Like, some people, like, it's a really big deal to, you know, throw out clothes. It's a really big deal to, you know, have to have, like, childhood pictures and current pictures in the same house. They have really mixed feelings. You know, I had a really great, fun childhood. I was a really rambunctious kid. And then I went into this tailspin in puberty where all these things were happening to me that took me out of that gender-neutral, fun play space of childhood and into this gendered adult reality. And unfortunately, those experiences then became the dominating force in my brain, was just those awful experiences. But I would say, you know, with my therapist, I actually had to visually, she led me through an exercise where I actually had to visually suppress those memories, because they were so traumatizing for me, the emotional discord, that I couldn't handle my current inner conflict and that at the same time. So that just like you need to acknowledge, I guess, the limitations of, you know, the emotional labor that one person can do. And I remember I imagined them being like paved over by a construction crew. And I was like, see you in hell. But now that I'm older, I can go back and I can appreciate the parts of my childhood that were really fun and amazing, and you know, sort of like focus on that and then focus on my reality. And middle school is just like out there. But so I would say like letting someone.
I just wanted to comment that I think it's important to acknowledge that the parents then, like Donald asked me to take pictures of him as a child out of the house. And so, you know, that's the emotional journey the parent has to go through. And if you don't accept that that's difficult for them too, it can create a lot of tension between the middle schooler and the parent. Like, well, but I had a beautiful little redheaded daughter and you're telling me I can't even show you a photo of that? And of course, to get mad at a parent for feeling that way wasn't helpful. So it was very fraught because the replacing of photos was very symbolic. And so it seems like a simple gesture. Oh, no problem. Let's just stick them in the drawer. And it's like, no, I have whole baby albums. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? And not one person has ever discussed that trauma with me of what that meant to do that. And yet I understood and respected how essential it was for Donald that I do that. And I'm glad that I did do that. But it wasn't easy, and I was never given an opportunity to ever discuss that symbolic gesture, which is where the Mapping Modern Grief chapter sprang from. Like, something just disappeared in my house, in my photo albums, and in my life. And you have to give me a chance to talk about that.
And I would also say briefly that something that I've been trying to do now to creatively kind of bridge that gap is for birthdays and holidays, like I try to take new photos. I try to like, you know, capture moments with me and my friends or really cool stuff that I'm doing and give that to my mom. So she has those sort of positive new memories. And we'll always have that alien picture of me. So there's that.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, hi Donald, thanks again for talking so openly with us this morning. Could you comment a little bit on what it was like to find the endocrinologist, commenting on possible puberty blockers and then on to testosterone and sort of how that made such a difference for you on your mood as well as
Mhm.
living your life?
Yeah, so the question was talk about how my experience was finding an endocrinologist and my experience learning about hormone blockers, testosterone, hormone treatment, and how that affected my mood and other aspects of my life. So it's interesting, and I get very like passionate about this because the first people that I called was Planned Parenthood, because I was like, they know about things. And they did indeed know about things, and they, or in fact, they didn't, but basically what happened was the woman at the other end of the phone was like, I don't know about this, but like, I'll help you out. And so like within 5 minutes, she was like online, she was like scrolling through websites, she was like, here's some names. And one of those names was Dr. Kielinski, who's in West Haven, and Trans People Network, and I reached out to some feelers. I was like, has anybody heard of this doctor? And my group facilitator, Tony Ferriola, was like, that's my doctor. Like, you're going to love him. He's great. I've never gone to a medical professional without a reference from at least one other trans person, because those are the people who are like putting their bodies in that person's care. Like, that's the person that I want to talk to. And so my experience obviously was great. I was too old to go on hormone blockers. So I had second puberty. And when I was on testosterone, I know we talk about testosterone being like, you know, it's a stimulant. It is completely different experience than, you know, having. What I think is so interesting too is that everyone has different levels of hormones in their body. Like some individual women have higher testosterone levels than some individual men. And then this idea that like, you know, hormones are so like bifurcated in people's minds, that a lot of times men don't realize they have estrogen. It's like, yeah, like you totally do. It's inside you right now. And I think the first few weeks were intense. Like you are tricking your body into stopping estrogen production when you're a trans person taking testosterone. And it literally was second puberty. I literally turned into the stereotypical teenage boy. I slept constantly. I ate like 4 burgers like a day, and but it felt like I was coming out of this depression that I obviously was in because of the sort of gender dysphoria, the trouble with my family, but also what felt like a chemical depression in my system. That there was almost like this part of my existence that hadn't been activated, and now that it was activated, it was like I was alive. And that wasn't just like a rush. I still feel that today. And it's incredible. It feels like almost like I'm a new soul. But hormone maintenance is very difficult. I have to get blood work every few months. I am constantly. I mean, my mom's had to help me out when I'm running around trying to fill prescriptions. CVS, who now is going to own like Aetna or something, because that's not corrupt. I was going to Walgreens, and then Aetna was like, you can only use CVS. And I was like, this feels illegal. Like, you can't tell me to use a pharmacy. And they were like, yes, we can. And so go to CVS. And then CVS would say they only had this kind of testosterone in, and no other store did. And then they would give me the wrong needles. And I would be waiting for like 40 minutes for these prescriptions to be filled. And it's just, that in and of itself is so tiring that many trans people, like, they let that lapse. They miss their shots, which is very bad because it unstabilizes your mood. It really wreaks havoc with your body, with your hormones. And so I don't know the limits of what you're able to ask in whatever medical capacity that you deal with people, but trying to make sure someone is at least having resources to deal with hormone treatment if they're interested is hugely impactful to mental health, not only for dysphoria, but for chemicals. But yeah, did that relatively give you some stuff? Okay.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your your honesty. I have a question for Mary. You mentioned that initially you were seeing several therapists and it wasn't helpful. And
Sorry,
my
go
question
no.
is, what advice would you have for the therapist of a parent of an individual who's transitioning?
I think first, it was most important that Donald got the care he needed because he was young. So the parent has to be mature enough to accept that the person is young. And so they have the addition of being a teen or a middle, even worse, middle school, right? So I did accept that. And I found the person that Donald saw in Boston that he liked. And I paid for his college education at a college that was gay, bi, lesbian, trans friendly. So that I was trying to be responsible about helping the way I could because I was failing as a mother, as a parent on some level, not to be able to connect with him when he needed me to connect to him. So I didn't feel like a failure as a person overall, but that you want to love your child and they love you and you can communicate. And we were not communicating. And so I thought, well, okay, school, safe space, good professional. What I did not do in time was to turn to myself after I took care of that. And I would always counsel the parent to first address the child because if they don't have some safety net, that's terrible. They're too young and it's hard enough. But I was wrestling depression, and I'm not bipolar. I have not been diagnosed with any particular condition. I was having a traumatic experience in my life. I do think it was exacerbated that I had lost my father when I was 14, and I was very close to him. So at a very young age, I'd had profound grief. So I was losing this other thing. That's how I was processing it. Didn't make it real, like I have my beloved Donald now, but that's how I was feeling. So I think that the counselor, the two people that I went to should have realized what an enormous step it was for me to go get professional help because I had never needed it in my life. I hadn't ever been diagnosed with any sort of mental health condition. I was clearly under great trauma because of an event in my life. And so don't tell me, yeah, that's a bummer, just like it'll pass. And both people, separate situations. First was like, your son is trans, deal with it. And the second one was, that's a bummer, I'm sorry, you're sad. And it's like, I'm going through catastrophic levels of grief here. And you gotta help me out. I'm having trouble helping my son. So I guess my piece of advice was, don't be discounting. Except that obviously, I was talking to like some of the top people who are going to be in the field that of course a person who's coming to you, that's a brave action, that they're even in your office. And that was discounting that they were like, oh, and to be honest, talk about all the different kinds of stereotypes people have. They were probably thinking, oh, this upper class white lady from West Hartford, needs to go get her counselor. And it's like, I've never been to a counselor in my life. This is really traumatic, and don't patronize me. I am having a very difficult experience, and they had a terrible time registering that. They were just thinking, you look fine. You're doing great. You're a professor. You own a house. You're doing great. And it's like, I'm not doing okay. So I don't know what else to say. It's just this complete denial that it was as bad as it was.
Just quickly, because I know there's some experiences that she's shared with me about being in environments like a workshop, for example, at True Colors, where a counselor even said like, oh, like I hate dealing with these like closed-minded, like shitty parents. And it's like, even though I often, have those feelings about the parents of my queer friends, it's like, yeah, but this isn't like about you and like what you feel and like your sense of like righteousness or how amazing you may be in dealing with these people. It's about your client, and it's about like, if you are committed to trans people, to queer people, then you're going to try to like help this family unit figure this out. Because when my mom had bad experiences with therapists, like I had more bad experiences with my mom. So
How are we doing on time? 5 more minutes. Any other questions? Yes. Okay.
I just want to clarify the question, I think, directed to the both of you. So recently, one of the kids I work with is exploring kind of his gender identity, and he's been exploring that with family. This is actually pretty supportive overall for a progressive family. And it was a really interesting conversation recently that started about anecdotally our transgender community see more male to female transitions. And the mom was kind of querying around, she's like, my background's in studying gender, and my child is thinking about transitioning, and I definitely support that. And I'm just wondering, is there something about being male in today's society that, we're seeing more of this? And nobody, and it was a really tough conversation, I think, in the context of like a therapy and family unit that's already struggling to really understand, 14-year-old, understandably kind of worried about a lot of different things, and there's a lot of grief, as you mentioned, that they're kind of processing. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that in terms of, I kind of saw my role as facilitating that discussion, but there were interesting points made about, the mom was kind of trying to understand, she said, what about being male is really appealing to you right now?
did everybody hear that question? Okay. So I would say, there's so many factors at play biologically, socially, psychologically, that it's hard to make any kind of call about what goes into a transition. I was asked recently, like, if we lived in a more gender neutral world, do you think you would even have transitioned? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, you can never know what goes into, like, the stew pot that is your human body. I would say that it is true that trans boys, trans men are the minority in terms of like there are more trans women. But in the same way that like, for the most part, gay people aren't straight people who had a bad experience and then decided to be gay because that was like this seems like more fun, it seems like less hassle. That it is a very visceral, identity-based thing that nobody sort of decides to just like, jump ship because another gender might seem more appealing or might seem easier. I would say that you may be dealing with a society that criminalizes femininity in men. And, maybe if we're looking at that gray area, if we had a culture that was more openly celebratory of gender variance, especially from male people towards the more feminine spectrum, you know, would that make a difference? Are we living in a society that that tolerates more, I guess I would say, butchness or masculine aesthetics in women more so than it does feminine aesthetics in men? Absolutely, I would say so. It doesn't tolerate gender variance very well as a whole. But, I mean, for me, I know a lot of trans people who have terrible conceptions about gender. Being trans doesn't mean that you know about gender. It just means that you know about your gender, which is great, but sometimes it means that you say terrible stuff. And when I first came out as a trans male, I really was anti-women in my head because I had lived so long in that body and I hated it. And I hated that part of myself. And so that became like this outward psychological issue that it took about 2 years of therapy to just like work through. And, you know, to the point where like I call myself like intersectional feminist, a queer feminist, a multicultural feminist. Like I love women and girls. Like I you know, have completely changed that around, but it took totally dismantling the social masculine ideal that I grew up seeing everywhere. Not in my own family, but like in my media, in my peer group, even in some of my role models. And that I think we can't underestimate how toxic and grating gender standards are on everyone, not just necessarily people who identify as a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth. It was a great question.
Just to follow up on what you just said, was your kind of initial rejection of femininity a complicating factor in relating with your mother?
That's a great question. I think that, you know, my cousin Oscar, who is trans, not related, but my cousin, their parents are lesbians. And Oscar said that when they came out as trans, it was really hard because their parents were lesbian second wave feminists, and so much of their identity was woman. And they took it as a total, not only rejection of the name they were given, of the gender they were given, but of what the family was about, what their parents' lives were about. And I'm sure that my mom, I can have her speak to that, that there was a part of her that was heartbroken at this sort of rejection of of daughter, you know what I mean? But I'll let you speak for yourself.
Come on that. I never felt rejected as the mom, but I did feel sad that my child was rejecting her sense as a daughter and a girl. And I was baffled by that because we had lived in a relatively gender neutral environment. And so then as a parent, I questioned myself. I thought, well, what did I do to make my own daughter not love herself? So that was the bigger issue for me. Rather than about me, it was about, well, how did that happen? And I am more convinced now it's just something deep and internal, and there might have been some kind of environmental factors, but there's so many possibilities for that. But we lived in a remarkably gender-neutral environment in our own home. I mean, I was a basketball player. I was invited to the Junior Olympics. I was a track runner. Then I was a single parent raising my own kid. I was hardly like an at-home mom who was like thinking that I didn't have any choices. I was all out there. So I didn't think that was a factor. But the fact that my daughter didn't love herself was very sad. And so I'm really happy to hear Donald has worked through, well, that's what it wasn't. It wasn't about that.
And we look at all the factors that go into gender, like hormones, secondary sex characteristics,
Yeah.
chromosomes.
Yeah.
You know, just like there's so many factors, and I mean, it was like when the HB2, the bathroom bill came out, it was like, what are we chromosome checking people at the door?
Yeah.
This is ridiculous, and gender identity is a part of that biology. Like it is to many people, it is inseparable from those other pieces. So that when doctors are like, well, you're medically female, I'm like, actually, I'm not, and I need care tailored to me, because
I think we're running out of time.
we're going to be around, so if you want to ask
Yeah,
questions
questions afterwards. We can't thank you all enough for being just the audience that we wrote this book for, really. if you could go out and work with these families, it would be so meaningful to us. So yeah, go out into the world, use Donald's great sense of humor. That's part of it, right? Thank you so much.